thank you for taking the time, and we'll be running this lunchtime session today for the first time, so please let us know your feedback as well at the end of it. So my colleague Pascal, myself, Olivia, we have Monse as well here, who is a consultant with LRI, and we thought we'd put together this session to give you a bit of an introduction to, in a way, the work that we do, the framework that we work within, which is the climate change negotiations, and then talking a little bit about some of the legal considerations that brings up, and hopefully where some of you will be useful in the context of either legal research or working along associates and partners in the law firms where you're based. And finally, we'll look at the COP28 and some of the expectations, or some of the expectations that are relevant for the beneficiaries that we have. I'm not going to talk about who LRI is. You can find all of that on our website, or you can ask us as well afterwards. But let's just delve into it. Great. Yeah, so if we go to the first part. So, and this might be recap, this might be, someone's bread and butter, but just for those that don't necessarily on a day-to-day work in the context of international agreements. So we have this international framework, which is a climate change regime that we will talk about in a minute more precisely about, but we have to sit this within the context of what it is, which is an international agreement entered into by states. And so there is a very helpful convention here, which is called the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which essentially brings together the customary international legal practice of how do you draft, how do you interpret, how do you amend treaties between states. And so when we're looking at kind of some of the questions that come up from our beneficiaries about legal interpretation of treaties, compatibility of different treaties with each other, then this would be our first port of call. And in general, the agreements, I think, international agreements, but particularly in the context of the climate change regime, are divided into two sections. We have a section which is the preamble, which tends to have sort of language that is not calling upon, that is not having any, that is not creating any rights or obligations. It's providing the context for those rights and obligations that are set up in the operative part. So if you look at some of the examples that are given here on the screen, we have verbs like recalling, noting, affirming. And in terms of legal value, this part of the treaty is not binding. And as I mentioned, it provides the context for the operative part. And where we come to interpret the operative part, one of the point of calls will be to look at the preamble and what the preamble might say in relation to that specific provision we are looking to interpret. And so then looking at the operative part, this is what actually constitutes the agreement between the parties. But it's not because it's in the operative part and it's an international agreement that it will necessarily be binding. So we have to pay attention to a lot of things, which also we will come into in a bit. But obviously words and hence the English language and mastering the English language, which we all do here, which is great, comes in very handy. And where there is a conflict between something in the operative part and the preamble, then the operative part prevails. There's a direct conflict. Slide. So within this, international public law framework, we then have the first in such international agreement, which is the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992 during something called the Rio Convention, alongside two other environmental conventions. And I should say as well here that this session is being recorded, so don't feel you have to absolutely capture everything. You will be able to go back over it, so you can just relax and take in the content. But coming back to the Framework Convention, so this was at the time of the Rio Convention, there had been greater understanding of the risks that humankind was presenting for the climate system, and in return, the threats that that would present for humankind. And so countries came together and agreed on this very broad framework convention that the objective was to stabilize the greenhouse gases emissions concentrations to a level that prevents dangerous man-made interference with the climate system. And as its name says, this is very much a framework convention that didn't go into detail about how this is going to be implemented. And that's how years later, parties negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, which was a protocol to the framework convention. And this was set up on a what's called a top-down approach, whereby the protocol established that certain countries, i.e. the developed countries, have legal obligations to reduce greenhouse gases, and there were consequences if they didn't. But this system didn't really work because by then the distinction between developed countries was a bit more blurred than it was in the 90s. And not everyone was part of the Kyoto Protocol because not everyone wanted to have such binding obligations. And so notably, the US wasn't one of the biggest emitters. And so it was felt that another agreement was needed whereby all the parties, i.e. all the countries, would all have obligations in respect to mitigation. And that's how we come to the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015. And it's set up on the basis of the bottom-up approach, whereby countries are free to decide what they do at the national level to mitigate, but they have to submit what they intend to do as part of their compliance with the agreement. And so now to go into the actual organization and how things work a little bit, I'll hand over to Pascal into the unit.
Yes. Thank you, Olivia. So, looking more now at the sort of process and how those negotiations, who negotiates, how these negotiations take place. So you have at the top there the Conference of the Parties, the CMP, which is the equivalent for under the Kyoto Protocol, the CMA, which is the body that is the governing body under the Paris Agreement. These are the main decision bodies of the three different protocols and convention. And they are tasked with really supporting the implementation of the convention, Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, as the case may be. They are supported in this task by a secretariat, which provides both sort of logistic and organizational support, but it also has got a lot of experts who will provide technical expertise, produce reports, etc. So this is a process in which states negotiate. So these are the parties to negotiate in this process. There are a lot of observers who attend the meeting and are part of it. So we go, but lots of other observer organizations as well. But it is only states that are negotiating. States tend to negotiate not individually, but as part of political alliances, depending on interests. So it's not uncommon for a country to be part of not just one alliance, but possibly two, depending on what is the topic being discussed and the interests that they have. So you have a number, we've listed a number of them there, G77 in China, which groups effectively all developing countries, is a very broad group. It, I think, covers 154 countries in total or something like that. So all developing countries. So inevitably, as a result, it has got very diverging, quite often diverging members and countries that have diverging position on a number of issues. So if that is the case, then it won't take a position, it will make a statement, etc. It will leave that to their subgroup. So you have other groups like the AGN, the African Group of Negotiators, least developed countries that are subgroup within G17, China, that might then take the floor if they are not able to G77, China is not able to speak on behalf of the whole group. So you have the African Group of Negotiators, the second one there, that is the only really proper geographical regional group, because its name suggests all African countries that share, all particular vulnerability in terms of being the most affected often by the impacts of climate change. Least developed countries is a group of countries. A large number of them are based in sub-Saharan Africa, but you also have a few in Southeast Asia, as well as Caribbean. Haiti, for example, is part of that. Really, they are also extremely vulnerable to climatic and economic shocks, etc., etc. You have the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, for which climate change often is an existential threat. So they have been extremely, despite their small, again, these small countries and their small proportion in terms of, if you look at the overall parties, they have been extremely vocal in the negotiation, in particular pushing for what's called loss and damage. Come back to that a little bit later, to be recognized as a distinct issue within the negotiation. They've been also pushing for a goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. You probably know that at the moment it's the 1.5 is more of an aspirational goal, and the 2% is really the goal that countries under the Paris Agreement anyway is the main global goal. So they've been pushing for 1.5. In terms of other bodies that are there to support the governing bodies, you have two permanent subsidiary bodies. There's a subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, and the subsidiary body for implementation that meet every session. So they would be actually meeting, particularly at the COP here in the first week. So a lot of the technical session at COPs tend to happen in the first week, depending on the agenda, according to the agenda items. And then in the second week, you will have political negotiation taking place at a high-level ministerial meeting, and then heads of state meeting, etc. So two permanent subsidiary bodies, and then in addition to that, you have quite a number of constituted bodies which have limited membership and focus on particular issue, like the adaptation committee that's mentioned here, very much focuses on adaptation. You have the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism Loss and Damage that focus on loss and damage. You have the LEC that focuses on reporting and transparency within the capacity, particularly of developing countries to report, etc. So you have a whole load of other bodies. You also have the entities of the financial mechanism, such as the GCF and the Green Climate Fund. And then you have ad hoc working group being set up as and when needed. For example, when parties were negotiating the Paris Agreement, they set up this APA ad hoc group on the Paris Agreement, with the specific purpose of negotiating it, but then it was dissolved once the Paris Agreement was adopted. So talking of which, Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 and then into force very quickly a year later. So as Olivier has already said, this is a treaty, the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, so it is binding for the countries that have that are party to it, that have signed it, ratified it, etc., etc. There is a really big difference between the treaty itself being binding for treaties and the provision, each of its provisions. And as we will see to some extent later, actually the Paris Agreement does not have many legally binding provision, commitments on parties, and those that exist tend to be around sort of procedural obligations to do certain things like reporting, like communicating information, submitting information, etc., rather than achieving certain things. So we'll come back to it in a second. The Paris Agreement, a bit like the convention before it, is very much a framework agreement. So it was set some principles, goals to be achieved, but it left a lot of details to be fleshed out, and that work then has been happening basically since 2016, with the countries also fleshing out, developing, implementing guidelines and rules, etc., on various thematic areas and issues, which collectively tend to be referred to as a rule book, which are effectively a set of decisions. So a first set was adopted in Warsaw in 2018, but then it didn't cover all the issues. So, Katowice, of course. So thank you very much. Yes, so more decisions were adopted in 2019 in Madrid, and then in Glasgow, another package of decision was adopted. So I think I will on to the next one. So very briefly, I mean, this is the Paris Agreement is quite. It really has got a lot. We don't have very much time, so I'm definitely not preparing to go into a lot of detail about it. Just really to flag the main thematic areas. You notice that it's not covering sectors of economies or anything like that. It's very much targeted at what measures are needed to address the challenge of climate change. The big one, which also was front and center in the convention and the Kyoto Protocol, of course, is mitigating, reducing emissions. And so in relation to that, parties, each country are committing to communicate and submit every 5 years what's called NDC, nationally determined contributions, which are effectively the mitigation plans. So these are, as the name suggests, nationally determined. These are set by the country. So there's not, in contrast to the system under the Kyoto Protocol, which, as Olivier was saying, did not really work, with lots of the largest emitters not agreeing to it. It doesn't set targets from the top, but each country very much decide what they're prepared to do in terms of their action and support, etc. And in addition to that, there are also low emission development strategies, so long-term strategies, which countries are encouraged to adopt, and many countries have adopted some already. Again, in terms of mitigation, looking at mitigation, the Paris Agreement recognized that countries may choose to cooperate to achieve their NDCs, and so it has established under Article 6 some rules for carbon markets. There are ITMOS, internationally transmitted mitigation outcomes, the Article 6.2, and then a special centralized body, supervising body under Article 6.4, which is a bit like the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, under the Kyoto Protocol. So that's very broadly for mitigation. I think we said before that the convention and the Kyoto Protocol were seen by developing countries as being very mitigation centric. When, of course, for developing countries, broadly speaking, particularly the smaller, the more vulnerable, actually adaptation is more of an issue. They're not emitting very much, but they are very much facing the impact of climate change, and so they really need. They wanted to raise the profile of adaptation to help them make themselves more resilient and provide support for adaptation, etc. So the Paris Agreement provided that with a global goal, a national goal on adaptation, and we'll come back to that a bit later, because this is now being fleshed out, as well as adaptation communications and encouraging countries to communicate their plan, strategy, and what they have done as well on adaptation. It also introduced a separate article on loss and damage. So this was a big achievement for developing countries, in particular the smaller island developing states, etc., that had been asking for it. That looks at really engaging and supporting a better understanding of loss and damage and cooperation, and also action and support. This was a success, but it was also felt that actually a lot of the focus up until last year or 2 years ago was very much on sharing knowledge and experience and understanding, etc., at the expense of actually action and support. And so developing countries have been pushing for that, and as a result, we now have a loss and damage fund. We have a Santiago network to Canada as technical assistance, etc. So there's progress on that. Then we have what's called means of implementation, which are, as the name suggests, group of measures, provisions that are designed to help countries implement their mitigation measures, adaptation plans, and strategy, etc. So we have under that finance, and we have technology transfer, technology being important component of climate change and the solution to climate change, and then capacity building, which is particularly important again for developing countries, to give them tools to be able to respond to the challenge that they face, as well as the sort of increased requirement under the Paris Agreement, particularly in terms of reporting, etc. So reporting. So there are 3 mechanisms in the Paris Agreement that are designed to provide some sort of accountability and scrutiny of parties' action and support to make sure that they effectively that they follow through on their commitments. So there is reporting under the enhanced transparency framework. So this is individual reporting by country. So there's provide both for reporting and review. There's also a global stock take, as the name suggests. This is designed to enable countries to, at a collective level, assess where they are at and what needs to be done to make sure that we keeping within reach of the goals and the purpose of the Paris Agreement. And then there's also a compliance committee, which is very much a facilitative committee designed to help countries, support countries in their measures. So it's not particularly robust, and it still remains to be seen to what extent it will actually have a meaningful role to play in this sort of accountability process. Yeah, that's just yes.
So at this point, we thought it'd be probably a dip in the attention, and some nice photos are needed. Nice, I'm not sure. This is the seat of the West German Parliament before the Berlin Wall fell. in Bonn, in the city of Bonn, in Germany, where the UNFCCC Secretariat is based and where the subsidiary bodies meet every year in June to help prepare the negotiations for the COP. And so these are just going to be a few photos. If you go to the next one, giving a bit of a flavor of what the negotiations look like and the different settings that there are. So typically, a plenary is where all the countries are meeting, either to open a meeting or to close a meeting and to formally adopt decisions before they close the meeting. These are very large and they have translation in all the UN languages. And I think I will just say that at this stage.
They're open to all parties.
They're open to all parties and observers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then once that body, let's say the COP has opened officially and has decided to open negotiations on a certain agenda item, we usually assign individuals from the negotiations to overlook a group of individuals from each of the parties to negotiate on that specific item. And so this picture here, I think what we meant to show with it was kind of the very technical detail at times that they have screens in front of them, not just their laptops, but in the middle of the room. I don't know if you can see that there's actual screens and negotiators there are going through the text and might be at times, negotiating over removing a bracket or adding a comma here or there. So it can be really quite technical. And there are at times issues with participation in these meetings, depending on if one of the parties raises an objection to the society organizations or observers being in the room. But more and more, I think that's less the case. It's fair to say.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the issue. I mean, observers tend to be allowed at the first meeting and at the last meeting. But sometimes it's enough for one country to say, no, we do not want observers to be there, for them to be, for us to be kept out effectively. It really depends on the issue being discussed, how sensitive it is. But yeah, some countries can be quite tricky.
Perhaps it's worth clarifying that the negotiations go for roughly 2 weeks. So the open plenary will be at the beginning of these 2 weeks, and then this will happen for those 2 weeks in multiple rooms. How many rooms do you think? How many negotiation topics at the same time? 25 perhaps?
Yeah. Say 25.
Well,
there's 25 agenda items, but
maybe not all happening at the same time.
Well,
certainly quite a few.
Yeah.
Quite a few.
Yes, good point. But yeah, that's the next slide. And so, whereas the previous photo was showing quite a formal way of negotiating, there is then more informal negotiations where in the downtime, outside of negotiation sessions, which typically run from 10 to 1 and 3 to 6 in the daytime. So either at the lunchtime or after the day is over, in the spare time that negotiators have, because there's not many, they might bump into people they know and they might have these kind of corridor conversations. And sometimes informal bargains, agreements can be struck this way, which then are taken back into the formal negotiations to help them progress. And yeah, the kind of picture that we see more in the press coming out of COPs are the typical sort of last minute huddles where there's kind of a crunch issue and it's been hours of negotiation. And the key players, usually the big developed countries, but also the big emitters get together to finalize and iron out and come up with something that they've agreed on. And I think this kind of exemplifies how unjust these negotiations can be. If you imagine you are from Burundi or you are from Tuvalu, already, English might not be your first language, but also to then have access to the final decision making, obviously, it's not going to be possible. You want to add something?
Yes, it's something that we haven't mentioned either, is that I think that the negotiations in this case need to reach consensus. Everything is agreed upon consensus, so that makes it more difficult. And that is why you see the huddles with the key players, because they have to agree on every line, and that explains perhaps the more framework architect of the main agreements and the need to then flesh them out in decisions, which also need to be agreed upon consensus.
Yes,
But
which was because parties never agreed to the draft rules of procedure, which sets out procedures for voting and adopting decisions. So the draft rules of procedure are applied, except for Rule 42 on voting. So that's the unfortunate circumstance that the parties find themselves at.
Is it me?
Yeah.
So, I think we have already touched upon this, that the Paris Agreement is a formal treaty, legally binding treaty, under the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, but there's a distinction between the treaty itself and its provisions, and many of them are actually non-binding, so voluntary commitment. Yes, so many create sort of more procedural obligation to do something, to communicate information, to submit reports, etc., but not actually, for example, to implement the nationally determined contribution. There's no legal obligation, let alone to actually achieve that. That has obviously implications for compliance, and as we have seen, there are some accountability mechanisms, scrutiny mechanisms to ensure that the countries follow up on what they have said, but actually these are limited in terms of the compliance committee. It doesn't have an enforcement branch; it can force countries to, but it is purely facilitative. I mean, this is because it's also parties. The parties are states, and so what you can force countries to do is limited. But you're very much counting as well on countries by ratifying, signing the treaty that raises some expectation, including good faith, to actually follow through what they said they would do. So some example here of the type of wording that you might find in the Paris Agreement, and showing you, the difference between the first one, which is binding obligation on country. It says each party rather than parties generally shall prepare, etc. Contrast that with, for example, provisions on finance, which says that finance will be provided to or shall be provided to developing countries. So it doesn't say who will provide it, it just says use of the passive form. So there's all sorts of the Paris Agreement was a very carefully crafted treaty with language really where all the wording was very carefully covered, very much being the result of compromise of what countries were agreed to have. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, this is really reinforcing how can you decide whether a provision is binding or not. There was different factors to determine this, including its location in the text, whether it's, for example, whether it's in the preamble or the operative part, and that applies to decisions as well as the treaty itself. Obviously, the language itself that is used, precision, normative content, etc. So you can see that different degrees of commitment. So shall or must is obviously stronger than should, which itself is stronger than may. Then you might have some qualifying language like shall endeavor is obviously weaker than due to commitment compared to shall. You might have some other conditional qualifying wording, such as the example there, as if appropriate, etc. And then there are often cases where actually countries, parties cannot actually come to a decision or agree on a particular course of action. And one way of dealing with that is basically to provide text that effectively postpone a decision to later on, and then they will have some sort of wording that effectively achieves that. So you might find wording to us with a view when sufficient information is available, we shall do that. So that is one type of technical language that might be used.
And so Pascal touched upon this earlier already a little bit, sort of the legal nature of the rule book. And so insofar as the treaty as a whole is a binding treaty between states, in the context of the COP and the CMA, of the climate framework, the climate regime, it is not deemed that the decisions of the parties create legal obligations. So this is quite important because often coming out of COPs, you will have news headlines or takeaways from different actors, from different stakeholders saying that yet something else has been agreed. And I think it is quite important to keep in mind that the actual binding provisions are not represented in the rule book. And having said that, it's not because they are not binding, they don't have importance, or they don't represent a political commitment, which is very strong. And we saw, for instance, out of Glasgow, the real impetus there was for the 1.5 degree coming out. And so this can have obviously a lot of power and can galvanize the public opinion and everyone around it. Also, the decisions often provide norms for different bodies and different committees to carry on their work during the year until the next COP. And so in that respect, it is binding upon them because they have to submit, or they have to prepare reports, and they have to provide a platform and test it and provide login details to countries. So yeah, that's just by way of keeping context. But so they're taking a step back, and I think, we could say a lot more obviously about the Paris Agreement, but you probably already have gathered from what Pascal and I have been saying that it's a far from perfect system that we have. And to name a few of the mishaps, the main one is that there is no obligation to fulfill mitigation, to fulfill the nationally determined contribution targets. There is also no individual review of a country's mitigation targets. And so, for instance, the concept of fairness in this context, how much should a developed country that has a larger budget be promising to reduce emissions versus even another developed country that has perhaps less of a budget versus yet a developing country that has smaller or larger budgets. So these concepts, there's no space really to review and assess them. There is also no burden sharing agreement when it comes to finance. So under the convention, this big divide existed and still exists under developing countries and developed countries by way of lists of countries that are or not in annexes to the convention, and some of the convention's provisions, the finance provisions, refer back to this distinction. And so at the time, very much those finance provisions are attached to who is in that list or not. Now the Paris Agreement has moved beyond that and has, in a way, recognized and allowed for a more dynamic process for countries to themselves decide where they fit according to their national circumstances. So that is another point. There is, you might have heard, the 100 billion climate finance a year target that has been a promise for many years that the developed countries would raise $100 billion a year. And we know this has been unmet. And on top of that, at the moment and coming up at the COP, which we will discuss, this will be the starting point for the next target. And so there's a lot of distrust amongst the parties in this system because, well, if you already have not met a previous target, you know, how do I know that the new one, which is supposed to be higher, will even be remotely relevant? And finally, a lot is also been said about the compliance mechanism of the Paris Agreement, which is toothless, and in a way reflects the fact that the obligations are mainly procedural, but so the compliance committee, for instance, doesn't have power to issue sanctions or fines. And some of the potential solutions to address these gaps, or some of the things that have been happening, is, for instance, to look at domestic implementation, and where, for example, in the UK, we have the Climate Change Act, which sets a legally binding target for net zero. And that allows, within the context of that country and the justiciability of that law in that country, to be followed through, such that there is at the international level. There's also, outside of these sort of the UNFCCC and parties, there's assessments of what countries are doing or not from academia, from civil society, that are very, very well regarded. And there's also climate mitigation, which I'm sure you have all heard of, is sort of rising and becoming ever more prevalent. And now we come to the part where we talk about the COP. So the COP is going to be from the 30th of November until the 12th of December, and will be taking place in Dubai. And I've sort of put an approximate tilde there because it could run over. Sometimes the conference does run over, and so maybe finish on the 13th or early hours of the 14th of December. We don't know. The first week of the conference will actually be the technical negotiations happening under the subsidiary bodies. So that will be the 59th sessions of the two bodies, the SABSA and the SBI. And at the end of that week, they forward the chair's conclusions. So each body has a chair, and that chair forwards its conclusions, which is based on what the parties have agreed, to the Conference of the Parties. So the Conference of the Parties to the Paris, to the Convention, which is number 28, to the Kyoto Protocol, which is number 18, and to the Paris Agreement, which is number 5. And there's adoption of the agendas, because that's also something we often get asked about, because there is, at the beginning of the conference, an agenda fight, an ability to agree to an item that has either been added at the last minute, or an item that was added sort of in the intervening period, in the lead up, and is contested. And for the first time at the subsidiary bodies meeting that just happened in June, we had a situation where the agenda of the subsidiary bodies was not agreed until the penultimate day after the negotiations had been taking place. And so we could potentially see, you know, a resurrection of that, some of the fights continuing because they haven't been yet put aside. There's been a few new proposals of agenda items as well over the summer, so that could lead to some further disagreements. And yes, this is an ever-evolving process that is becoming so complex. And I think this is why, as well, you know, we are so keen to have volunteers who are interested in the work and, you know, year on year want to continue working with us, because it's a steep learning curve, and then you keep up with it, but hopefully you also, you know, find it very, very engaging as well. And now a few specific items that we've picked out from the agendas, but there's much more, obviously. So the first one there is the Mitigation Ambition and Implementation Work Program, which is already an abbreviated version of the its actual title. So this was sort of a work program that arose out of Glasgow, so that was 2 years ago, when really IPCC reports had been coming out that say, undeniably, we are in a critical decade we have to, by 2030, reduce emissions by at least 45% in order to keep 1.5 degrees within reach as a target. And so looking at the current mitigation plans at the time, and if countries follow through with those mitigation plans, there was no way that that would be achieved. And so in Glasgow, there was this big movement to revise mitigation plans more often than the Paris Agreement sets out to do. So the Paris Agreement sets out, says to parties, you have to submit new plans, updated plans every 5 years. And the work program kind of went beyond that and urged countries to do so effectively a year later. It came to COP27 and only about 23 countries or 26 countries had done so. And the hope that there was that this mitigation work program would be further strengthened at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh were not quite met. There was just a restatement of what had been said in Glasgow and no further language, for instance, on things that had been said in Glasgow, such as the phase down of unabated coal power, which was a win in itself. And so people had expected that this would go further in Sharm el-Sheikh, and it didn't. This is now a question mark as to what will happen. Obviously, we know, Dubai, we know the interests of the UAE in terms of their industry, their main industry. At the same time, the COP28 president has come out and said that it's undeniable that there needs to be a phase out of unabated fossil fuels in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. So watch this space as to what the decision could say on this item.
The next item that you have there is the development of a framework for the global goal on adaptation. I mentioned briefly this goal. So this was an achievement of the Paris Agreement, something that had been demanded, that had been requested by developing countries for a long time to have a global goal. But the Paris Agreement just establishes the goal, but does not say anything. So it's still quite vague as to actually what it will mean in practice. And of course, in contrast to mitigation, it's not as easy to quantify. So this is really what this is about, and this is what the discussion had been taking place. So in Glasgow, a work program was established to flesh out effectively see this global goal with workshops. 4 workshops happening every year with a view to arriving to some sort of decision on it next year. So there's discussion are happening, but there's quite a lot of disagreements between, broadly speaking, developing countries that really want that say that this framework should include clear goals with targets, clear indicators, really to guide the international efforts on adaptation, and that it should also include some options, etc., to link it with the domestic fair, because of course adaptation to a lot, mostly first and foremost, I should say, is very much something that happens, on the ground. So it needs to be linked with the domestic sphere, and also to make sure that adaptation is integrated and strengthened within national sectors. So yes, that's what developing countries are saying. In contrast, developed countries, yes, do recognize that we need to have methodology, etc., but they see it more as an exchange of expertise, good practices, etc. And they very much question the need for having global indicators, and actually are very much also questioning the need for a clear framework at this stage anyway. So that's where we are at on that. And earlier we were thinking about the Japan.
Yeah, so this, thank you. This is a new agenda item that comes under finance as a result of the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, where For years, as Pascal had mentioned, countries have been asking for more action and support in relation to loss and damage, and had not been successful in doing that. And then finally, at the COP, parties decided to establish a fund. And because it's so difficult, and it is proving difficult to actually agree on the modalities of this fund, that's just what the decision said, and set out a process for how it will be operationalized. So this year, there's been a so-called transitional committee, which is tasked with developing some of the principles and some of the modalities which will be recommended to the COP. And just a few days ago, they finished their 5th meeting, which came up with a draft recommendation for the COP. But this is, at the moment, receiving mixed messages because it's felt that from a developing country perspective, the text is very weak and sort of, for example, sets the fund for the interim under the World Bank, which is already seen as an institution that is not fit for purpose and in need of reform. And importantly, the US claims they were not in the room when the decision was being made on the final text, and so that does not represent consensus. So it's basically open again to be negotiated. So I think it remains to be seen, and I think some people would say that they would prefer that the damage fund be operationalized at the COP rather than the current proposals. At least that's what I've heard from some people. I'm just conscious of the time, but we should be able to run through the rest fairly quickly because we wanted to also give you an opportunity for questions, of course.
So very briefly, this new collective quantified goal. So at COP21, countries decided to do that a new collective goal should be set with a floor of so taking as a starting point the existing goal of mobilizing 100 billion per year from 2020. As Olivia has said, this first goal hasn't been met, but countries are now negotiating for this new goal. So the first one, the 100 million, was very much a goal that was decided at a political level. I wouldn't say that it was just plucked out of the air, but it was not really, it was not really decided looking at it from a very scientific, technical basis, looking at exactly what are the needs, and et cetera, et cetera. So this new goal is trying to achieve that more, and so there are discussions happening now on various issues. So primarily what's referred to as a quantum, so what will be the quantum of this goal, but also what will be the sources. When we're talking about source, we're talking about contributors, which we're talking more generally as with public or private sources, innovative sources, etc., etc. So these are all really big issues that are being discussed at the moment. There had been, so there was a work program established at CMA3, so 2 years ago. There's some what's called technical experts dialogues that are happening to sort of flesh this out. And the idea is to agree one next year. So the negotiations are ongoing and they are, progressing, but they seem to be, looking at it at a high level, there seems to be frustration that these technical dialogue are not really doing what they are doing, and there's been call for effectively perhaps needing a body or some sort of committee to move those negotiations forward. And then there's also quid pro quo with it's linked with the finance goal. Remember that we talked about the 3 goals under Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, finance flows, and whether it should be linked to that or not. And again, countries have very diverging positions on that. I'll stop on that. And then the global stocktake is again one of the big issues that will be decided. So this is a process that was started 2 years ago. So it's the first stocktake. These happen every 5 years. And there are 3 phases or 3 components in it. The first one is inputs, so parties, but also civil society and various bodies, scientific bodies and others, etc., provide a lot of input. Then you have a technical dialogue to effectively discuss those inputs and trying to understand them and then synthesize them in some sort of form that can be understood and used. And then so that's phase finished in Bonn in June. And we are now entering into the third phase, which is a more political phase, which is effectively looking at outputs and outcomes, bearing in mind that, as I've said before, the collective, the global subject is meant to be assessing where we are at, so looking back, but also looking forward with a view to informing countries with their next round of NDCs. And so they are, if you look at submission of parties, really, there's still a lot of things that really need to be decided and very little time for that. So they have no agreement on the format, what kind of format will this outcome take? Will it be a decision? Will it be a declaration? Something else altogether? No agreement on the content. At the moment, there is just an outline of some sort of structure, but it's still very, very vague. And so, yeah, very broad outline. Some countries think that it should be just backward looking. Others think that it should very much be forward looking and addressing gaps and pathways for addressing those gaps. So there are divergence sort of there. Etc., etc. So I won't say more because we're running out of time, but just to give you a very broad flavor of the discussions on that would be really interesting to follow.
I will be very short. I will just say that the negotiations on Article 6, so that's under the three cooperative approaches, whereby countries can cooperate with each other to achieve their NDCs, so-called carbon markets and one non-carbon market approach. These negotiations will also continue at the COP, and happy to speak individually with anyone that has more specific questions about them. I think I will stop there at this stage. And thank you all for coming, for taking the time. And hopefully you can spare a few more minutes for questions.
Yeah. And just to maybe flag that.
Yes, just to flag that if you cannot separate yourself from the Paris Agreement and want to have it on your phone, you can explore its content. We have sort of provision by provision explained it, and it's available